Well, hello everyone, and I'm sorry for the problems that we've run into here. I'm delayed, but I guess Cam has taken over. And essentially, what we're encountering here with the proposals to place royalties on either farmers' own saved seed or endpoint royalties on farmers' entire crop is really an attack on the fundamental basis of agriculture, where farmers have saved and reused seed for thousands of years. The problem that we're encountering is that the legislation that we currently have is what's known as UPOV 91, and it's Bill C-18. It's based on an international union for the protection of plant varieties that essentially is an industry body that supplies template legislations for national laws. And the national law that we have right now is Bill C-18, passed February 27, 2015. Gave a massive amount of rights and control to plant breeders / generally companies, although we still have a robust public breeding system in Canada, which we need to continue to support and to make sure it isn't usurped. So the reality is that plant breeders have massive rights. I believe Cam went through it and described the types of rights they have. And farmers have a privilege that's optional, a privilege that can be taken away or made unworkable. And the farmer's privilege essentially allows them to save and reuse seed to use on their own farm only. They cannot sell seed, they cannot exchange seed. They can clean seed, condition seed, which is known as conditioning, and they can use that seed only on their own holdings. This was a massive win for private companies, private seed breeders, in that the argument has always been the same, that farmers need these kinds of legislation in order that innovation will take place and that private investment will take place. And the government is pushing that idea that all of the solutions can really only come from private industry rather than the public breeding system. Those of us on the webinar can see this slide, the plant breeders' exclusive rights. And of course, they have exclusive rights, and the farmer just has an optional privilege. And their exclusive rights are listed A to H there, and that's to produce and reproduce, to condition, to sell, to export, to import, to stock, and to authorize conditionally or unconditionally the doing of any of these things with seeds. In many ways, this plant breeders' rights legislation gives them even stronger powers than patents, particularly on the control of exporting and importing of materials. So if we could shift now to the farmer's privilege slide. The farmer's privilege, as I had described earlier, the farmer only has the right to save and reuse seed for planting on his own holdings. He cannot sell or exchange seed, and he can store seed, and NFU was instrumental in getting the legislation amended so that farmers were allowed to store seed, because we argued when it was brought in 2015, how on earth can you have a privilege if you can't store seed? The NFU was the only organization that vigorously advanced that idea until other people absorbed it and didn't just tacitly accept the legislation with the same old arguments that, you know, investors need this and that's the only way you're going to get innovation and advance in agriculture, if you have these kinds of protections and mechanisms for the private seed industry. Okay, so the big problem, and what we're seeing with this royalty collection scheme, is that farmers' privilege can be subjected to limits. And those limits, as I list in the slide here, can be the complete elimination of seed saving, where, for example, it's not customary at the moment for most farmers to save canola seed. So by a simple regulatory change, they could eliminate the possibility of exercising the so-called farmer's privilege on canola seed. As one example, it could apply to other things. It can be limited to the number of planting cycles. They could say, well, you can save seed to plant 2 years, or maybe only 1 year. It can be limited to what kind of farmers, what size of farm. There's a myriad of possibilities that and criteria that can essentially make the farmer's privilege essentially unworkable. The royalty plan, the trailing royalty plan that the seed industry at the moment is favoring and that's being advanced, is to have a royalty charged on the farmer's own seed, his own saved seed. Companies, breeders would be doing absolutely nothing except collecting the money. Now, of course, that raises many questions, including where, who sets the level of the royalty, how it's used, at what level these things can be set. It's profoundly undemocratic. The breeders would be able to set the royalty rates, and farmers would have little or no say. Under the current proposal, actually, they would have no say. Could we move to the next slide, please? So, who decides on limiting farmers' privilege? There's an advisory committee that's been put in place, appointed by the minister, that makes recommendations as to how plant breeders' rights legislation is unfolded in terms of the regulatory capacity, etc. The governor and council, the cabinet, would change these conditions for seed saving by a simple regulatory change without amending the act. And the committee is made up of breeders' organizations, seed dealers, seed growers, farmers, and horticulturalists. On this slide, we see that we have, for example, Syngenta, Cantera Seeds, the Canadian Seed Trade Association, which is made up of a lot of large interests in the chemical and seed industry, the Canadian Seed Growers Association, which originally was created under the Canada Seed Act in the farmers' interest and the public interest, has been attracted to this model. And if we could move to the next slide, the Seed Synergy Group has been advancing this dialogue that I mentioned earlier, that if we don't have these sorts of mechanisms in place, there's problems, particularly with cereal grains, wheat in particular, that it's falling behind, that we're not having enough innovation, that there's a crisis in wheat breeding and breeding in general, and that the solution, again, is that farmers' privilege should start to be eroded, and this idea of putting royalties on farm-safe seed and eroding the farmer's privileges is a normalization of this erosion, and this eventual, he moves to the road of eliminating or making the farmer's privilege unworkable, which we in the NFU and farmers and citizens find completely unacceptable. Could we go to the next slide? So this is the Seed Synergy Group. This, the Canadian Seed Growers Association, the Canadian Seed Trade Association, the Canadian Seed Institute, Commercial Seed Analysts, Canadian Plant Technology Agency, and CropLife Canada. CropLife Canada, of course, is comprised of, and we'll see that in a later slide, of many of the big agrochemical companies, as well as the Canadian Seed Trade Association, as indeed there's tremendous overlap. The Canadian Seed Institute and the Commercial Seed Analysts are a relatively small group of laboratory analysts, etc. And the Canadian Plant Technology Agency is an enforcement agency that uses people to attempt to entrap farmers that may have been accused of selling seed illegally. The big problem with all of these UPOV mechanisms is that in reality, they are changing age-old practices of thousands, indeed 10,000 years of farmers nurturing and saving seed. And they're attempting to position farmers and citizens as cheaters, as a problem, as the people that have to be disciplined and taxed. And this is fundamentally what the shift in relationship to seed is taking place through Bill C-18, our plant breeders' rights, and the UPOV mechanisms. Next slide, please. Here's a list of the people and companies in the Canadian Seed Trade Association, BASF, Bayer, Crop Science, Cantera Seeds, which has a relationship with Lima Grain, a big French seed company, Corteva, which is Dow, Nutrien, which is huge in fertilizer and chemical industry, Syngenta, which is now part of ChemChina, etc. Can we go to the next slide, please? As you can see, the reality of these organizations that are both part of the advisory committee for plant breeders' rights and this Seed Synergy organization is they wish to advance their interests in producing seeds that they can maximize their revenue extraction and maximize their revenue extraction from farmers and ultimately eliminate over time farm-saved seeds so that farmers become dependent on them at their prices for that seed. Next slide, please. So the idea is farmers pay royalties on their own seed or the entire crop. The entire crop would be endpoint royalties. This is a mechanism that's used in Australia, for example, where farmers, when they deliver their crop for sale, a royalty is taken off of that and then passed on to the owner of the variety that the farmer grew and the production of that crop. Or farmers pay on their own seed that they've saved themselves to plant on on their farm. As I mentioned earlier, farmers have no say at what level the royalty is set at. They have no say on how the money is used. They're told they must pay up to facilitate innovation and competitiveness. They're told there's a crisis. They become subjected to the normalization that they must pay to save seed, and farmers will encounter seed saving and reuse becoming more difficult as old varieties are deregistered. And the registration system is an integral part of the Canadian seed system. For a farmer to grow a commercial crop, he has to plant a registered variety. And that registered variety is subjected to currently the UPOV 91 regulations, which make it possible to have royalties charged, which make it possible to have restrictions on a farmer using seed. And a lot of varieties were registered under our previous plant breeders legislation, which was UPOV 78, which was much less restrictive. I apologize for being late to this and perhaps a little disjointed initially, but we'll open things up for questions now for 10 minutes, and then we'll move on to the next section.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm sorry it's noisy where I am. Is the regulation already closed? Like, is there still open consultation on this, or where are we at in the regulation and the regulatory process?
Well, there's so-called consultations taking place. Later on in this presentation, in the next section, we're going to discuss how the regulations would be done, what the timeline is, and what the mechanisms would be and the process. But short answer to your question, which I'll give a much more detailed answer in the next sections, is that the regulations are not in place at this moment to put in place the royalties for farm safe seed.
Okay, Cam here, there was a question from Susan Roberts, typed question, and she asks why is the NFU not a member of the advisory? Can you maybe speak to that, Terry? The advisory committee?
Certainly. The NFU, the minister has chosen not to appoint any representatives from the NFU. Unfortunately, and again, this will be in another section, the Ministry of Agriculture has been quite hostile through the past government and this present government towards the National Farmers Union. And indeed, there's been very little change from the bureaucracy standpoint from the Ritz administration, the Harper administration of Agriculture Canada to the Macaulay administration of Agriculture Canada right now. So we see the same players advancing the same interests in the department, in this advisory committee that we saw in the past.
Okay, another question that was typed in was from Astrid, and she was asking about taking cuttings and the privilege. So she's asking, can farmers take and propagate cuttings, Terry?
They can propagate cuttings, but only for use on their own holdings. So again, they cannot, the propagating methods of seed is the most characteristic one, but cuttings they can, but they cannot, exchange them or give them to a neighbor or use them on anything other than their own holdings.
Terry, it's Kathy. Could I just clarify that that's for the newer varieties that were registered after February 2017. Older varieties are still under UPOV 78, or if they're very old, they would be in the public domain. So these issues affect our newer varieties that were registered after the new changes to the Plant Breeders' Rights Act came into effect. I think that's important for people to know.
Yes, that's, thank you for that clarification, Kathy. Yes.
Yes. So basically that would be anything that has been registered up until now, and then since 2015, February, and anything going forward, any registered variety of plant. And the next question is from Karen, and she was basically wondering how you would count propagating cuttings. Is each, do you count each cutting, or the fact that all these cuttings came off one plant? How would that basically be looked at, and who administers and who pays for the administration?
Well, that's, of course, those kinds of things have yet to be rolled out. In other examples, an example in France, for example, a person selling plants propagated from cuttings at a local farmer's market was the plants were confiscated and by the authorities here, and they were claimed to have been illegally propagated. And so obviously currently what we see is the variety owners and under the Act are responsible for enforcing their rights and for launching legal action against so-called infringers. So if they had the capacity to do that, they would, capture whoever would be deemed to have illegally be propagating or exchanging cuttings, etc.
Okay, I've been reading some questions that have been typed in, but is there anybody on the phone who'd like to unmute themselves and ask a question? Okay, if not, then I'll just move on to another one of the typed questions. This is from USC Canada. They were wondering if a royalty is paid on the entire crop, is it also paid when the seed was initially purchased? And basically, would the farmer have to be paying the royalty twice?
Yeah, that's a good question. And in terms of the endpoint royalty system as it exists in Australia, for example, the farmer would be paying, when he initially bought the variety, the royalty, and then after that, the production that flowed from that seed in consequent years would be, the farmer would have to declare the variety that it was produced from, and then that royalty would be charged on the entire crop at whatever level it was deemed to be. This, of course, means a complicated system of verification, of scrutinizing crop insurance records. It's, and some people have termed it gun control for seeds, but it would require seed cleaners and all sorts of elements in the agricultural seed system to keep records, and farmers themselves to offer up records and to submit either the royalties themselves or have the buyer that they've sold their crop to submit the royalties in the case of an endpoint royalty. In the case of a farm-saved seed royalty, then the farmer would have to submit, and he would have to make declarations as to what variety he's used and how much seed he's used, and et cetera, et cetera. And also, I just might add that in these endpoint royalty mechanisms, those people that grow forages are charged a royalty each time they cut their forage crop. So that has been thought through.
Okay, we have time for one more question, and that will be from Ken Larson, or K Larson, I'm not sure. The question is, these companies all manufacture pesticides, so why would they develop seeds that do not need their chemicals? And your thoughts on that, Terry, please?
Yes, I think that this is an extremely important question and comment. Obviously, they want to sell a package. That's the most profitable plan, and so if we lose our public breeding system that works in the public interest and shift to a private based system that's dominated by the large agrochemical companies, I think that it's quite clear that they would be selling seeds that would be responsive to their fungicides, to their particular herbicides, and that this would be a very expensive proposition for farmers, and they wouldn't likely develop seeds that are naturally resistant to various diseases, or they may, but certainly the focus would be on a package system where farmers are increasingly paying more and more to utilize these sorts of things. And that's where this actually this variety registration system that we'll talk about in the next sections becomes important, because of the cancellation ability on the older varieties. So I guess we could move into the next slide on the PowerPoint. So I think this flows quite nicely from the question that Ken, the last question that was asked, and that was, you know, why now? What's going on? What's potentially going to happen? So why now? Because it is possible. It took the legislation, Bill C-18 in 2015, based on UPOV 91, to make it possible to have the legislative framework to charge royalties anywhere in the actually in the food system, but in the production system. So by simple regulatory change, we can be confronted with royalties. Obviously, Seed Synergy, which has had significant financing from Agriculture Canada, unfortunately, is aiming to maximize profits for their membership. Again, the usual suite of companies and players that we have shown earlier by creating monopoly conditions. The other element that we're experiencing in Canada is the suggestion and the reality that we've seen government funding for public research cut back for a long time. And the suggestion is being made that the very good varieties and work that Agriculture Canada has done in the past, and other public breeders, that they would do all the basic heavy lifting research, and then they would turn over the final finishing of varieties to the private sector so that they could profit from marketing them and selling them. Again, farmers recoil at these kind of ideas, particularly because farmers have invested significantly of their own funds in supporting the public sector research and are willing to continue to do so. Of course, if you restrict access to new varieties and to extract maximum payment for seed, you can do that through a series of mechanisms, contracts, you know, that you either can't save the seed or that you there are no other options in a particular crop kind because old varieties have been canceled or deregistered. And unfortunately, prior to UPOV 91 legislation being enacted in Canada, the previous government gave variety holders the right to cancel their registration as they see fit, which means that older non-restricted varieties, when they can sell these packaged varieties and varieties with restrictions, with royalties, etc., they are very likely to cancel those varieties and replace them with the new UPOV 91 with higher restrictions. The other piece of this, and we've seen this in the canola model where patents have been used as the mechanism to eliminate farmers from saving and reusing seed, is independent seed producers have by and large been replaced by contract growers that are tied to the corporation. So really they become subcontractors to the corporation to produce seed. And in Canada, we have about 3,500 independent seed growers that multiply pedigreed seed and do a good job of it. But unfortunately, their organization, the Canadian Seed Growers Organization, has endorsed this idea of royalty collection and ultimately reducing the possibilities for farmers to save and reuse seed. And I think they do that at their peril, because at that moment when farmers are completely dependent or largely dependent on corporate suppliers, the space for an independent seed grower will disappear as well. And the costs, of course, will go up drastically for farmers. And the profits for independent seed growers, if there are any left, will drop significantly as well. Next slide. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that has become apparent over several years is that somehow the idea that innovation, competitiveness, sort of business nomenclature is the appropriate goal for agriculture. So things like the public good or you know, the common good have evaporated. So public breeding is being replaced or threatened with the idea that the private sector should be doing this. But of course, the private sector will only do this that comes at a price. And over the years, we've seen mechanisms put in place to facilitate the private sector's interest in this. And so seed synergy, for example, it's very disturbing that Agriculture Canada, which, you know, is part of our government, using our taxpayers' funds, has significantly funded an anti-citizen privatization model that would transfer wealth from farmers to corporations. Agriculture Canada is also advancing the false idea, or at least representatives out of the bureaucracy at Agriculture Canada are advancing the idea that wheat yield improvements are falling behind privately funded breeding programs like canola, for example. The reality is that a cash-strapped public sector breeding has produced results on par with a very well-financed private system that has huge amounts of money flowing into it from incredibly high prices they're charging for seed. Canola in Western Canada is probably the best example. Virtually almost all farm-safe seed has been eliminated, and farmers are paying $600 plus a bushel for seed from these players. Now, wheat seed, which farm-safe seed is the norm, farmers occasionally buy new varieties from independent seed growers who have multiplied pedigreed seed. They pay anywhere from $12, $15 to $20 a bushel for that seed. And then they are perfectly capable of growing it on their farm and saving it in a very good manner, in high quality, for replanting on their farm in continuing years. And this is just a normal practice. This is normal practice of agriculture. But one doesn't have to speculate very much that the price of seed, when farmers can no longer save seed and buffer that price and have that option, will go up drastically when it's exclusively supplied by the private sector. Next slide. So here is a study done by Dr. Robert Graf, and the graph displays the increases over time from 1981-82 to 2013 of wheat yields, and through public sector varietal development. That's the top line, the red line. And of course, the reason why the graph goes up and down is you have variations in individual years because of the droughts and environmental conditions that result in drops. But the average increase has been quite decent, and indeed it's on par with private breeding efforts of canola. And the reality is there's no crisis in our breeding program. There's no issue with our competitiveness with our public breeding system. The crisis is that government is choosing to potentially transfer the public work to the private sector, and to put in place the mechanisms that make it interesting for the private sector. But the reality is the results from the public sector breeding in cereals and wheat have been very good. Next slide. And of course, this transfer of having the public sector develop varieties only up to a certain point and then transferring it to the private sector is very distasteful for farmers and for citizens. It's exploitative, and the reality is that farmers, citizens, people have saved seed for 10,000 years. They've improved it, they've exchanged it, they've nurtured it, and it's only in the last 100 years that we've had more scientific methods for varietal development. But indeed, it's quite possible through collaborative breeding programs that are quite successful in other parts of the world, and some of them are being attempted in Canada, for farmers and breeders to work together to develop new varieties that meet the needs of farmers and end users, etc., without these exploitative mechanisms like UPOV to facilitate private sector breeding. We know that most crops are still primarily developed by public sector breeding, but we are seeing in the world that the UPOV laws are slowly shifting the balance to the private sector, where really 10,000 years of genetics and work and preservation by untold generations of farmers is could be, and to some extent is being usurped in just a few decades. Next, please. So
Terry, this is Cam, just for a minute. You've taken about the amount of time you wanted to on this section, just so you know.
Okay, well, I'll just very quickly talk about variety registration and UPOV 91. So what we have is since February 27, 2015, all varieties registered after that date fall under the UPOV 91 regulations, which means they could potentially have royalties attached to them, either endpoint, farm saved, which means that those varieties could have all sorts of restrictions placed on the farmer's privilege, etc. And the previous UPOV 78 varieties, the Seed Synergy, Agriculture Canada is saying, well, you guys don't have to worry. You have those 78 varieties available. If you don't like the conditions imposed by the 91 varieties, you can always grow the older 78 varieties. But the problem is that those varieties are allowed to be canceled by the variety owner, the breeder company, and they will do that the moment on the varieties that they have under 78, the moment they have a replacement model that's under 91 that's more profitable and available to charge royalties and place restrictions on. So as it says at the bottom of the slide, the public interest element is being pushed aside to create a system that gives priority to private commercial interests. And the farmer is just seen as a consumer. Okay, I guess we can take questions now on this part.
Terry, it's Kathy. I just wanted to add in a little bit on the varieties registered, because we have not all crop varieties require registration under our Seeds Act, but even varieties that don't require registration under the Seeds Act can be registered for plant breeders' rights. And so the plant breeders' rights system is broader than the registration system. So that's I guess something for people to know, like corn doesn't need to be registered under the variety registration system, but it is still subject to plant breeders' rights.
Yes, and of course, the corn, the vast majority of corn seed sold is hybrid seed that doesn't produce true in the second generation. So they have that sewed up. In terms of, again, corn seed is extremely expensive per bushel too, because of hybrids. So, you know, what the private sector is interested in is really eliminating the ability of farmers to save and reproduce seed cheaply. So if they can charge royalties on it and make it expensive, if you want to save seed, fine. If you can use biological methods like hybridization to prevent or not to make it worthwhile for farmers to save seed and charge significantly higher prices for seed, fine. Or you can use legal mechanisms like the variety registration system and plant breeders' rights system and slowly eliminate things where it's easier for farmers to save and reuse seed.
Okay, I'm going to, once again, I'll just ask if there's anybody who's on the webinar by phone, if you would like to unmute yourself and just ask a question verbally. I'd like to give you that opportunity right now.
Cam, Derek, you're calling. Can you hear me?
I can. You bet, Derek. Go ahead.
I'm interested to hear Terry expand a little on the subcontractors replacing the pedigreed seed growers. pedigreed seed growers, of course, are subject to quite a bit of scrutiny and maybe a few years to build a reputation. Are these subcontractors subject to any kind of standard that the private seed trade had been? The reason I'm asking is these groups seem to be appearing in different communities, so I find this particularly interesting.
Yeah, this I can't speak with complete authority on that. I do know that what has happened largely is that seed growers that have been subject to the regulations and scrutiny have been indeed shifted on certain crop kinds like canola to subcontractors, and that the tagging and the quality assurance in Canada is still there under those systems. But so the so-called blue tag for seed assuring quality and standards and et cetera, so that a farmer can be assured of the quality, those mechanisms are still there. But what happens is that those subcontractors, those seed growers, find that they maybe produce more volume or whatever for the subcontracting with a large corporation, but that comes at a reduced profitability in some instances. Again, when this sort of thing becomes generalized, this will change. And indeed, I can speculate on the day where it will be suggested that that our system is a burden for getting varieties out there quickly by commercial interests. But that is speculation on my part, but probably a likely scenario.
Okay. Now, once again, if there's anybody on telephone who'd like to ask a question, now would be a good time. Otherwise, we'll go back to our types questions.
Hi. Hello?
Hello. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, how do heirloom seeds play into this? Is this just, are those considered registered at all for production, or?
The heirloom seeds, when one is, just growing them for their own purposes, they can do as they like, in their own gardens or on their farms. The question comes in is when you attempt to commercialize the production of those heirloom seeds. Some of them may have been registered at one time and deregistered. So technically, you, as a commercial farmer, you can't legally commercialize them to sell. The heirloom seeds are a bit of a gray area because they're not significant enough production that there's been very much enforcement mechanisms imposed on what's going on with them. But nevertheless, at that point where, for example, people started shifting en masse towards heirloom seeds, that they would indeed come under the scrutiny and the restrictions in those crop kinds where registration is required to commercially grow them.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Was there somebody else on the phone who wanted to ask a question?
I had a question.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there any research that shows whether the increase in yield is primarily due to better research, or is more due to increased inputs such as fertilizers and pesticides?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know, in reference to the example that we use here, the graph study. I imagine that the bench line would be is that the agronomic element or the input element was probably consistent with the current practice at a given year. And that's a good question, because I know with canola varieties in particular, there's been a lot more inputs put in, fertilizers, etc., over time. That certainly impacts yield increases. So if I can't actually answer that authoritatively, because it would seem logical that the increased inputs result in increased yields, but whether these particular studies took that into account, I do not know.
Okay, well, I'm going to switch back to the typed questions. We have time for probably 2 more, I'm guessing. And basically, Astrid was wondering if farmers are still allowed to take their own cuttings, or has that right already been taken away, Terry?
No, they can still use those cuttings on their own farm if it's a UPOV 91 variety. That is still possible to use on their own holdings. Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the next question was from Karen at USC. She was wondering what happens if crops fail. If farmers need to pay royalties, the seed companies need to guarantee minimum yields. More of a, not really a question, but a statement. So it has to go both ways. Another, like I say, I don't think it's really a question, but from Donald, also at USC. Figures it's different seeds, and if each seed is considered as an agent of the variety, then each seed planted or harvested would be subject to the royalty. So yes, any time you regrow a seed, I would say that it would be subjected to the royalty. Is that correct, Terry?
Yes, if the royalties are in place. So it would either be, if the royalties on the farm save seed, it would be there, or if it's on the entire crop, it would be charged in accordance with the variety that is that the farmer would have to supply. In order for this system to work, for the royalties to be passed on to the variety owner, the farmers would have to make declarations as to what varieties they're growing, and then at the time of sale, that royalty would be attributed to that particular variety owner.
Okay. The next question is from Pierre Olivier. He asks if you know of any examples of farmers who have had consequences. I'm assuming he's talking about UPOV 78, such as getting sued or their harvest being taken by the industries. And he's wondering, I think he probably means, he does say in Canada in particular, but if you know of anything internationally, I guess you could just comment on that. And this will probably be our last question for this period.
Yes, well, of course, we all know the examples from canola, which are extensive, and soybeans and others, where there's gene patents on herbicide tolerance, and farmers have been sued and have been subjected to all sorts of legal strictures. As we move on to the next section, we're going to talk about the interconnection with trade agreements and enforcement mechanisms, et cetera, and all of these things that can flow that may relate to this question in a more particular way. Farmers certainly have, if they have advertised and sold seed with a variety name attached to it that has and been caught, they have been fined and had legal strictures placed upon them, because under our current system, farmers cannot sell and exchange seed. So certainly there's what's called, it's an industry organization that appears with a name that looks like a government agency. Is called Canadian Plant Technology Agency, that watches newspapers, that watches advertisements, listens to radio announcements, et cetera, to see if anybody is advertising and selling seed that's outside of the regulations and laws that we have in Canada, and they certainly go after those people.
Okay, and Cam here, I can just, I guess, add a very brief thing that happened to my brother just this past summer. Is he was approached by somebody who was basically working for, I'm assuming, the Plant Technology Agency, and they were asking him to help participate in a sting for a farmer from another province who had been selling seed illegally as far as they were concerned, and they wanted my brother to contact this fellow and try to get him to basically break the law where these people were aware of it and could prove it. So not only are they actively searching for people who, as Terry says, place ads, but they're also participating in sting operations too. So anyway, we've got about probably just over 15 minutes left in the webinar. So Terry, do you want to maybe just take over again and touch on whatever you want to in the way of slides?
Sure. If we could move to the next one. I don't believe we talked about essentially derived, which is a huge win, and it will facilitate monopolization of the seed industry for private sector players. And in the Act and under these UPOV models, there's essentially a clause called essentially derived, which is up on the screen, that in a sort of a thumbnail sketch, if a breeder develops a variety that a variety B that the owner of variety A says is essentially derived from their variety, all the rights that they have under plant breeders' rights legislation for variety B would go to variety A, the owner. And of course, that's a very gray area as to how you determine what essentially derived is, but it's extremely wide in terms of the methods used, including even spontaneous mutation of a variety. It could be claimed that it's essentially derived, and that say if something beneficial came out of a spontaneous mutation, all the benefits would flow back to the owner of variety A. And this is problematic, this essentially derived clause amongst some of the farming community and other people. The idea is okay, well, if we have these royalty mechanisms in place, let's just create our own breeding entities, and then we'll benefit from the varieties. The problem is that, again, you run into this litigation issue of being challenged probably by the large players that your variety is essentially derived from one of theirs, so essentially it's theirs. And then you would lose any benefits of trying to operate as an independent entity. And that's why it's important to stop these mechanisms that would erode or even eliminate farmers' privilege in their tracks, and not allow the idea of royalties and those sorts of things to be charged on farm-safe seed to be normalized in any shape or form. If we could shift to next slide about how all of these, and yes, these and all of these things interact. So we've already talked about the extensive and exclusive plant breeders' rights. We've talked about the optional farmer's privilege that can be eroded, modified, watered down, subjected to all kinds of criteria just through regulatory change. I just talked about essentially derived and the litigation issues. And then there's the trade agreements. Because plant breeders' rights are considered intellectual property, there's in the trade agreements in CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between Canada and Europe, the so-called Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, etc., all have inside of those agreements what are called precautionary enforcement measures, which essentially say that for the alleged infringement of an intellectual property right, including a plant breeder's right, the alleged infringer shall be subjected to the precautionary seizure of their movable and immovable assets, the freezing of bank accounts, and their communication of financial data to the complainant. In addition, any third party, say if a farmer took his seed to get cleaned at a seed cleaner and he hired a trucker and he hired the seed cleaner and he was claimed to have infringed on plant breeders' rights by doing that, that third party would be subjected to these precautionary enforcement measures, which essentially creates a culture of fear in the countryside and total compliance, even where beyond where it's necessary to in how you use seed and how you relate to how you do agriculture. And of course, the farmers confronted with litigation under these precautionary enforcement things, especially if their bank accounts are frozen, how do they even hire legal counsel under such circumstances? The private large companies, of course, one could say, well, they could be litigating against themselves over issues of essentially derivation of, who's infringed on who. But they actually have come up with an arrangement amongst themselves, which are called material transfer agreements, where they'll exchange germplasm and materials amongst themselves with different sorts of agreements on how they will share the proceeds of those arrangements. Of course, they would be certainly not very happy to get into arrangements that didn't benefit them significantly, either with public sector breeders or independent farmer-run organizations that would attempt to develop varieties that would be in the public interest at low cost. So all of these things interact. And then the critical thing is what's called investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. As we've seen in these examples, CropLife Canada, the Canadian Seed Trade Association, these people are the biggest agrochemical companies in the world. And they can utilize the arrangements in these trade agreements to make sure that if there's any restriction on farm-safe seed, on farm privilege, that it can never be reversed. And if it's attempted to be reversed, this could be considered tantamount to expropriation of their future profit potential on the selling of that variety, of the collection of that royalty, and that the respective government, the Canadian government in this example, would have to go through this tribunal process, this arbitration process, and would be liable to pay them for their lost future profits in marketing their variety under whatever restrictive conditions there were. So this is why it's absolutely critical that we don't allow any of these mechanisms to diminish farmers' privilege. And indeed, we're going to argue that we need far beyond a privilege that farmers' rights enshrined in legislation would go far beyond. But nevertheless, the trade agreements, the essentially derived mechanisms in the UPOV mechanism, the extensive plant breeders' rights, the enforcement measures, all of these things come together to make it very, very difficult for people to do agriculture in the future. They can potentially come together. That would be unimaginable to our ancestors even one generation ago, that control over seed and agriculture could be so extensively transferred to oligopolic interests that are attempting to control that around the world. Okay, if there's another slide, we can move to that. And there's questions. So I guess we're quickly running out of time. Maybe
we've got about 7 more minutes, Terry.
Yeah, maybe I'll explain how the regulations could take place. Now, the restrictions on farmers' privilege under our current legislation, I'll do this very quickly, can be done through a simple regulatory change. That means that the legislation doesn't have to be opened up and amended. It doesn't have to go back to Parliament, to parliamentary committees for examination and debate and different readings, etc., to amend it, to change it. It can be done by regulatory change, and in Canada, regulatory change takes place. The minister can go to the, under this legislation, to the governor and council, the cabinet, and say, we want to make these changes to farmers' privilege. We want to allow these royalty mechanisms or whatever other restrictions we want to do. And they just have to publish it in Canada Gazette Part 1. And in Canada Gazette Part 1, there's a commentary period. It can be set relatively short or longer, depending on the issue, where citizens can write in and comment about why they don't like the regulatory change. The minister just has to take that under advisement, and then they simply publish, if they choose to make the regulations in Canada Gazette 2, and essentially that regulatory change is the law of the land. And how quickly this can happen? It can happen quite quickly. This whole consultation process that Seed Synergy is pretending to do and that Canada is pretending to do is about setting in place the idea in the public's mind and in other members of the government's mind that there's consultations that take place, that people are supportive of these things, and they can very quickly, within 30 days, they could potentially change this. But this has to go to the governor and council. That's the cabinet. We can apply pressure to the cabinet, to the agriculture minister, to all of these people to say we don't want any of these things. We want to reinvigorate the public breeding system. We're not interested in transferring and letting the private large corporations usurp the seed in this country and in the world, indeed. And unfortunately, we have what's called regulatory capture in the agriculture Canada, so much so that they're financing Seed Synergy to advance these ideas and to pretend that an appropriate consultation has taken place. Our Minister of Agriculture seems to be on side with all of these ideas. Indeed, obviously, he's approved the financing of Seed Synergy, and he has bureaucrats that are advancing these ideas on behalf of agriculture and Agriculture Canada. I think I'll close there, and I'll let maybe Cam talk about what we can do. as our time is running out quickly. And maybe if he finishes that up, we can take a couple more questions.
Okay, so just briefly, I'd like to let you know that we do have a lot of information on our website, and up on this page here, you've got some of the, not only the main website, but the various campaigns that we're running right now. So go to our website, which is nfu.ca, I believe. Kathy, can you confirm that?
The website,
Yes,
nfu.ca, and there's a button right at the front page that goes to the Save Our Seed page to make it convenient. Just click there and you'll get to it.
Okay, there's also like an action group that you can sign up to where we'll keep you informed as things change. It's really important that you share your views on this, because if we are going to stop it, and I believe we can, but it's certainly not going to be easy. We have to make sure that this is a discussion that is taking place among a lot of people. So basically, if you can talk to your neighbors in your community, if you're at a coffee shop, at a meeting of some sort, let them know what's happening. Writing letters to your local paper is also very good. If there's a call-in show that deals with this, or just an open topic, phone in and let them know, and then comment on social media. Our hashtag is Save Our Seed, but if you're on social media, on your Facebook page, share this, pass stuff on. Contacting federal officials is extremely important. Your member of parliament, Agriculture Minister Macaulay, Prime Minister. If you are more, want to dig a little deeper, you could also contact members of the Ag Committee, the critics for the opposition parties as well, basically letting people in Ottawa know that we're not happy. So you change the next slide, Kathy. We have a petition you can download. Basically, it requires that in order to send this to your local member of parliament, you need 25 signatures, and then they are required, obligated, I guess, to present that petition in parliament, let the rest of the parliamentarians know that they've received it. The printing on the side of this page just lets you, gives you a little bit more information. There is information on our website how to find your members of parliament, so you could know who to send this to. But we would also like you to send it in yourself if you would, but also get a copy to the NFU by fax or scan it to us or mail it to us, letting us know who it was you sent it to. That would be greatly appreciated. Next slide, Kathy. We have postcards. You can download the template for this and then take that template to a local print shop and they can print it for you on cardstock. It would probably be about, I think, 50 cents, 70 cents each. But if you're going to be to an event and you want to have these available, it's certainly a very good way of making sure that other people are aware of this issue and then they take the action. Because the more individuals we have basically contacting our federal representatives, the better we are, better off we are. Next slide, Kathy. So basically, another thing is we certainly are looking, we're always looking for more members, either farmers, single farmers, or families. You can join as a full voting member. Non-farmers can also join, pardon me, as a non-voting associate member. And you can go to our website once again to sign up, and the links are there for you. Also, if you don't feel you can or wish to be a member or of the organization, we also very much appreciate donations to help us move this particular issue forward and all issues forward, which are relating to farmers. Just something to keep in mind is National Farmers Union does not take any donations of any sort from corporations or government sponsorship. We will apply and use grants that are available to everybody for things like more bilingualism, etc. But we do not take any donations, so we're not beholden to any group other than the people we represent, which are farmers. And then the last slide, I guess, just has our website on it, I believe. So jot that down if you're interested. And Kathy, are we allowed to go a little bit over if people want to ask a few more questions? Well, not hearing Kathy respond, I will maybe open the floor again to other questions. There was one from Sadie Macklin. I believe Terry more or less answered it, but she was just wondering, basically, can seed cleaners be held liable for basically, I'm assuming, cleaning seed that is a UPOV variety? And would they have to pay a royalty to do that?
Well,
Terry,
they could be held liable if they were implicated in the stream of the illegal use of the variety, depending on whatever strictures were put on it. Certainly, we haven't had litigation yet utilizing the precautionary enforcement measures that I talked about in the trade agreements, where the third party could be subjected to all sorts of restrictions. But certainly, I think that the data required to make this system work will implicate and pull seed cleaners into the system in ways that they don't like, and certainly make them very, very cautious and perhaps scared of continuing their business because of potential elements that they could be subjected to.
Okay, and Diane was wondering if you'd still be able to sell these registered varieties as feed.
You could sell them as feed, but you would, if there was endpoint royalties in the system, like in the Australian example, you would have to pay the royalties on the feed as well. And indeed, even the royalties on the feed that you use inside your own farm, they have calculated mechanisms, and it actually comes at a cost, because they have sort of companies that do this kind of work, and farmers have to do all kinds of documentation in order to make sure that these endpoint royalties are allocated to the particular variety holder. So if you use the feed on the farm, if you sell the feed, if you sell the crop for other purposes, if you cut your hay and bale it, if you feed your grass to your cows, you are subjected to potentially to endpoint royalties.
Right.
If it's a protected variety, if it's produced from a protected variety.
Okay, very good. So just as a note, we do have a record of the questions. We're certainly not going to be able to get to them all. We have about 36 at the moment, but we do have a record of them, and we can, the ones that we think are particularly pertinent, we can try to answer on our website, frequently asked questions, if they're not already answered there, actually. But one more question was, what is the perspective of public plant breeders on the proposed changes to PBR regulations? Do you have a comment to make on that, Terry?
There's a range of perspectives. Some public plant breeders are, they have a strong sense of the public good, and that what they're doing is to advance the public interest, and they're quite happy to maintain and build upon a system that encourages and facilitates those kinds of things. Other public plant breeders actually believe the rationale that these kinds of mechanisms are necessary. So there's a range out there. But nevertheless, if they were adequately financed, and again, farmers have put forward significant amounts of money through their commodity checkoff organizations to finance public breeding. And if the government was financing it and farmers are willing to step up to the plate even more, I'm sure, I think that those public breeders would be quite happy to operate in a public system that's functioning for the public good. And they just have, some of them have become desperate due to the cutbacks, and they see that these mechanisms might be a way to facilitate the continuation of their work in plant breeding.
Okay. Maybe one more question. Does anybody on the phone have anything they'd like to ask? Okay, if not, then the last question that was typed that we'll get to is basically corporate control of the seed supply. Wouldn't that limit varieties to just a very few? I guess, what's your opinion on that, Terry?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you create a system, and that's essentially what we're doing, if we allow these changes to happen, and a good many of the changes have already happened. I mean, as a corporation, you're interested in maximizing profit, and there's a number of ways to do that. You can offer a good product that's very popular and sells like crazy. You can use regulations to push out competition and create monopolies, and then once you have those conditions in place, you know, why do you need to develop more and more varieties if you can profit from a small suite of varieties, indeed import varieties from elsewhere? And that's what's been so good about the Canadian public system, is that the varieties have been developed on a regional basis to fit regional environmental conditions. And that is critically important. And if you shift to a one-size-fits-all that's mostly concerned about maximizing profit and sales packages, obviously you're going to lose diversity and the success and the contributions that we've had in the past. And then one closing remark: agriculture contributes immensely to the Canadian economy. $47 billion in sales. It contributes to our positive balance of payments, and it only makes sense to spend a relatively small portion of taxpayer-funded money to develop public varieties distributed at low cost with ease of use to continue to support an agriculture that continues to support the economy of this country, and not transfer that wealth from farmers and from taxpayers to the biggest corporations in the world who seek to control the seed. And they know how powerful that is, and we don't trust them with that power, because those that control the seed control the food system, and we're not going to let that happen.
That's a very good way to end it, Terry. So I'd like to thank everybody who's still on the call for having participated. As I said, there's lots more information on our website. Also, my phone number is up there. Don't hesitate to give me a call at home. And if you have any questions you think I can answer, talk to Kathy at the office as well. She's as knowledgeable pretty much as anybody. And just keep on fighting this. It is, like I say, it's something that we can, I'm sure we can win if we apply ourselves and get enough other people behind us, but it is going to be extremely difficult. Can't pretend that it's going to be easy, but it is doable. And as Terry was just mentioning how important that is. So I'd like to thank Terry for taking the time to walk us through this. Kathy for basically putting this together. I do apologize for the problems we had early on. We thought we had everything worked out, but as it turns out, we weren't quite as ready as we thought. But certainly, if we have another one, we will be a little more on top of our game. So keep an eye out. If we are going to have other events, we'll be certainly letting you know. I encourage you to sign up to our action group. But Kathy, do you have anything you'd like to add before we shut her down?
Just also, I'm noting that all of the really good questions that we didn't have time for, and I think what I'll do is put those together in a frequently asked questions sheet that should, answer those questions and probably spur some more questions. And it's a really interesting dialogue, and I really appreciate everybody's engagement and interest. It's been really great to have you here.
Yeah, and I'll
Okay, well,
be happy to participate and answer questions by email or other ways as well.
okay. Well, thanks again, everybody. And Kathy, if you want to just shut the meeting down, the webinar down.
Sure, will do. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.